For centuries, travelers, historians, and whispered voices within Rome have spoken of a room that should not exist. Hidden within the labyrinth of the Vatican Library, it is said to be sealed behind walls of oak and stone, protected by guards who never speak and archives that never age. This is no ordinary chamber. It is rumored to house maps that do not align with the world as we know it. Maps that chart forgotten lands, vanished civilizations, and coastlines that suggest history has been rewritten, reshaped, or perhaps deliberately erased. The Vatican Library itself is a monument to human memory. More than 1 million volumes and manuscripts are stored within its vaults, some dating back to the dawn of recorded language. But for all that is publicly displayed, the gilded Bibles, the ancient papyri, the illuminated manuscripts, there are whispers of entire collections locked away from view. Collections accessible only to a handful of the most trusted clerics. Within those shadows, the legend of the Forbidden Map Chamber was born. Explorers returning from the New World told of strange discrepancies. Islands charted on one parchment, but missing from another. Sailors spoke of stars that did not match the heavens as they knew them. Certain cartographers claimed that older maps contained fragments of continents long thought to be myths: Atlantis, Lemuria, lands beneath the Antarctic ice. And in the back alleys of Renaissance Rome, it was murmured that the Vatican kept these dangerous charts hidden, safeguarding truths that could shatter empires. Some researchers insist these whispers are nothing more than superstition fabrications spun by rivals of the Church, envious of its power. Yet others claim that even within official Vatican records, clues appear. Marginal notes by librarians mention restricted sections. Centuries-old letters describe documents kept in silence until the appointed time. And then there are the testimonies from those who claim to have glimpsed what should not exist. Shelves lined with maps of worlds never recorded in our history books. Consider the context. In the 15th and 16th centuries, maps were not merely tools of navigation. They were instruments of power. Whoever controlled knowledge of geography controlled trade routes, colonies, and the fate of nations. To possess a chart that revealed hidden resources or secret passages across oceans was to hold dominion over the earth itself. If the Vatican truly did hoard such maps, it would mean they guarded not just spiritual authority, but earthly supremacy as well. And this is where the story grows darker. Why would such maps be locked away? Some believe it was to prevent chaos. A world suddenly told that Atlantis was real, or that Antarctica had once been free of ice and thriving with human civilization, would question every doctrine, every sacred history, every empire built on the foundation of the Church's version of truth. Others argue the motive was more strategic by controlling knowledge of the world. The Vatican ensured it remained the broker of exploration, conquest, and colonization. The tale of the Forbidden Room has persisted because it thrives in silence. No official has ever admitted its existence. No visitor has ever taken a photograph. But absence itself becomes a kind of evidence. Why, after all, would so many speak of a chamber that holds no weight in reality? Why would so many explorers, scholars, and travelers across centuries echo the same claim that within the Vatican's heart lies a vault of maps too dangerous for the public eye? Imagine standing in those hushed corridors of the Apostolic Library, the air heavy with dust, the ceiling painted with saints watching from above. Every book you pass is catalogued, numbered, guarded. But behind one door, just one, there is nothing catalogued at all. Only silence, only secrets. And inside, perhaps, the geography of a world we were never meant to see. This is not merely a question of lost maps. It is a question of lost history. If the chamber exists, then our past is incomplete by design. The lands we think of as myths may have been real. The civilizations we dismiss as legend may have thrived. And the story of humanity as we know it may be only half told. And so the whispers persist, generation after generation. The Vatican denies nothing because it never needs to. Silence is stronger than denial. Silence leaves space for the imagination to grow, for suspicion to spread, for the forbidden to take on a life of its own. Perhaps the chamber is only a rumor. Or perhaps it is a truth so heavy that no institution could ever risk revealing it. One thing is certain. Where there is secrecy, there is power. And in the shadows of the Vatican, that power has lingered for centuries, guarding maps that may show not the world we see, but the world that was stolen from us. Beneath the marble grandeur of Vatican City, beyond the echoing basilicas and sunlit courtyards, lies a labyrinth almost no pilgrim will ever see. It is a world not built for worshippers, but for wardens of secrets. A fortress of memory known simply as the Vatican Secret Archives. Officially renamed in 2019 to the Apostolic Archives, the change in name was subtle, but its meaning was unmistakable. The word secret had carried too much weight, too many whispers. Yet even stripped of its title, the aura of secrecy still clings to it like incense in a closed chapel. Imagine endless corridors stretching beneath the city, deeper than the eyes of tourists will ever wander. The numbers alone boggle the mind. More than 85 kilometers of shelving, stacked with manuscripts, letters, maps, and tomes that span over 12 centuries of human history. A scholar-granted entry might walk among parchment that holds the very inked signatures of emperors and kings, letters from Michelangelo himself, or Galileo's plea for mercy when he was condemned by the Church. These are not dusty relics, but pulsating veins of history, preserved in climate-controlled chambers where the air is as carefully monitored as in a laboratory. But here is the first mystery. Only a chosen few may enter. Scholars and historians may petition, but even those granted access are guided with precision, allowed only to see the material they request, never to roam freely. One wrong word in an application, one suggestion that curiosity is veering toward controversy, and the doors remain closed. In this way, the archives are both a treasure house and a prison for knowledge. The Vatican does not simply keep history. It chooses which parts of it the world is allowed to touch. What does this say about the human relationship to truth? To walk inside is not merely to study. It is to be reminded that history itself can be owned, guarded, and even withheld. Every folio locked away is a fragment of the past chained to the will of the present. Scholars who have gained access speak with awe, but also with hesitation, as though they sense the invisible boundaries drawn around them. The archives are patrolled not by guards with swords, but by rules, restrictions, and an unspoken sense that some corridors are best left unseen. For every ledger opened, there are thousands more that remain untouched, resting in darkness. It is this imbalance that fuels centuries of speculation. If the Vatican holds the spiritual heart of Catholicism above ground, then below it beats the forbidden's mind of history. Rumors have flourished for generations. Some whisper that the vaults contain documentation of heretical gospels, writings of early Christians that were suppressed to maintain control over doctrine. Others claim the archives conceal correspondence about extraterrestrial encounters, secret deals between popes and dictators, or even prophecies too dangerous for the public to hear. The truth is rarely addressed, because the Vatican rarely explains. Silence, after all, is the perfect companion to mystery. But the very scale of what is known makes the silence more unsettling. There are letters from Mary, Queen of Scots, pleading for her life before her execution. There are files from the trials of the Knights Templar, documents that sealed the fate of a once powerful order. There are treaties, secret alliances, and records of wars negotiated behind cathedral walls. History books may tell us one story, but down in the archives lies another, written in the ink of those who lived it, unseen by most. Why does the Vatican guard it so tightly? The official explanation is protection. Manuscripts must be shielded from decay, handled only by trained professionals, studied only for legitimate research. And yet the restrictions go far beyond preservation. A document that challenges accepted narratives could unravel centuries of belief. A letter that contradicts official doctrine could fracture the authority of the Church itself. To open the archives fully is to invite chaos, and the Vatican knows this well. And so the question lingers. What is hidden in the shadows of those corridors that even popes have chosen not to reveal? The archives are not simply rooms filled with parchment. They are an architecture of power. They remind us that truth can be a weapon, and in the wrong hands, it can destroy as much as it enlightens. Perhaps that is why the archives are both admired and feared. They symbolize the tension between knowledge and secrecy, between faith and control. The air within those vaults is cold, the silence unbroken, but the weight is palpable. Each locked cabinet hums with the gravity of withheld revelation. The archives of shadows are more than a collection. They are a paradox. They exist to preserve history, and yet by being hidden, they rewrite history every day. Because what we cannot see, we cannot question. What we cannot read, we cannot challenge. And so humanity stands above these chambers, gazing at the basilicas and monuments, never realizing that beneath their feet lies the greatest unanswered question of all, not just what the Vatican knows, but why it has chosen not to tell. From the beginning of human civilization, the urge to draw the world, to trap it in lines, symbols, and stars, was more than an act of knowledge. It was an act of power. A map was never just ink on parchment or clay pressed with a reed. It was a way of declaring, this is what I know, this is what I rule, and this is where the unknown begins. The earliest surviving maps do not look like the elegant globes we see today. On ancient Babylonian clay tablets, etched around 600 BCE, the world is a circle surrounded by water. At its center, Babylon. Beyond it, 7 triangular regions stretching into mystery, representing lands no one had ever reached, but that the imagination could not ignore. These maps were less about accuracy and more about cosmology, attempts to order the universe, to prove that civilization was at the center, and that chaos lived beyond the horizon. Yet the Babylonians were not alone. Across the Mediterranean, Greek scholars would transform map-making into a science. Claudius Ptolemy, in the 2nd century CE, compiled what became known as the Geographia. His work contained coordinates for more than 8,000 locations, a staggering attempt to pin the world into mathematical certainty. His grids of longitude and latitude, though imperfect, revealed a mindset centuries ahead of its time, the belief that Earth could be measured, charted, and mastered through reason. And yet, Ptolemy's vision was not the whole story. Far to the east, the Chinese were charting the heavens with equal devotion. The Dunhuang star map, dating back to the Tang dynasty, is one of the oldest surviving star charts in the world. More than 1,300 stars were carefully marked in detail, a cosmic reflection of the world below. The Chinese did not separate geography from astronomy, for in their philosophy, to map the heavens was also to understand the rhythms of Earth itself. Navigation, governance, agriculture all were tied to the patterns in the night sky. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the Islamic Golden Age brought forth cartographers who blended knowledge from Greece, Persia, India, and beyond. Al-Idrisi, commissioned by King Roger II of Sicily, created one of the most extraordinary medieval maps, a silver disc engraved with the known world. His maps included trade routes, mountains, rivers, and even accounts from travelers who had ventured into lands Europeans thought unreachable. His work was not simply copied, it was treasured, guarded, whispered about in courts and libraries. A map that stretched from the icy north to the sands of Africa and the spice islands of Asia. So how did all these maps, Babylonian clay, Greek calculations, Chinese star fields, and Arab engravings find their way into Europe? The answer lies in conquest and translation. When Constantinople fell in 1453, ancient manuscripts flooded westward, rescued by fleeing scholars. Traders, monks, and emissaries carried copies of Arabic texts into Italian libraries, with a Renaissance thirst for forgotten knowledge turned dust into revelation. Somewhere in this flood of parchment and ink, it is said, maps of astonishing detail slipped quietly into the hands of church authorities. Imagine a Vatican scribe, deep in candlelight, poring over scrolls that showed lands the Bible never named, coastlines unknown to medieval Europe, or even stars arranged in ways that suggested a different history of the heavens. These maps were not just academic curiosities. And so, some historians whisper, the Vatican began to gather them, the clay tablets that reduced the world to a circle, the mathematical grids of Ptolemy, hinting at lands across the ocean, the Chinese charts of stars invisible from European skies. The Islamic maps that suggested routes to kingdoms and riches Europe had yet to claim. Each map, in its own way, a threat. Each one a fragment of a puzzle that, if put together, might reveal a world that the Church was not ready to admit existed. Consider the possibility. When explorers like Columbus and Magellan sailed westward, they may not have been sailing into the blind. There are theories, controversial, but persistent, that some of these ancient maps were quietly shared, redrawn, and passed into the hands of those who claimed they were venturing into the unknown. Perhaps the Vatican had already glimpsed the Americas on some forgotten parchment. Perhaps the routes across oceans were not accidents of courage, but rediscoveries of maps that had existed long before. Whether hidden or revealed, these maps carried weight beyond their paper. To own a map was to own a secret. To guard it was to hold the world in your hands. And in the dimly lit archives of the Vatican, where whispers say forbidden knowledge still lingers, the mapmakers of antiquity continue to speak through clay tablets, through starry skies, through grids of ink and silver lines, offering a vision of the world not as it was taught, but as it may have always been. In 1929, tucked away in the dusty archives of Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, scholars stumbled upon a fragment of parchment that should not exist. It was a map, dated 1513, drawn by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis. At first glance, it looked like a typical chart of the Atlantic, showing parts of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. But when examined closely, it revealed something far more unsettling. A detailed outline of Antarctica, centuries before its official discovery. Even more confounding, the southern continent was depicted without its thick blanket of ice, showing mountain ranges and river valleys that would only be confirmed by 20th century seismic surveys. How could a sailor of the 16th century have mapped a continent buried beneath miles of frozen wasteland? The discovery shook historians, geographers, and even military analysts. Charles Hapgood, a professor at Keene State College, famously proposed that Piri Reis must have copied his chart from ancient source maps, relics of a civilization that had charted the globe in unimaginable antiquity. Hapgood's ideas gained traction when the U.S. Air Force examined the map in the 1960s and admitted that certain details seemed to align with classified seismic surveys of Antarctica's subglacial terrain. In other words, there was information in the Piri Reis map that should have been impossible to know in 1513. This was no accident of imagination or artistic flourish. Piri Reis himself wrote notes in the margins of his map, explaining that he had drawn from 20 charts and Mappae Mundi, some of which were ancient and handed down from lost traditions. He claimed that among his sources were maps from the time of Alexander the Great, a statement so extraordinary that it forces us to ask what kind of records were preserved, copied, and hidden across empires and epochs. Here is where the Vatican's shadow looms large. For centuries, the Holy See collected, confiscated, and preserved maps from across the known world. Explorers, missionaries, and scholars often found their discoveries absorbed into the Church's archives. While kings and merchants pursued profit, the Vatican pursued knowledge, and then guarded it with iron secrecy. Could it be that Piri Reis's mysterious sources were fragments of an even older cartographic tradition, one that the Vatican still safeguards in its vaults? The idea is not far-fetched. The Vatican Library contains thousands of manuscripts from ancient Greece, Rome, Byzantium, and beyond. Among these are geographical texts, Portolan charts, and copies of Ptolemy's Geographia. But if Hapgood and other researchers are correct, the true treasures may be those records never catalogued, never displayed, and never admitted to exist. Documents that trace humanity's knowledge of the world back to an age long before history officially began. Consider what the Piri Reis map implies. Someone, at some point in the deep past, had the capability to chart coastlines accurately, across oceans, and with a precision that rivals modern techniques. This was not the work of medieval guesswork. It suggests advanced navigation, possibly even aerial surveying. It suggests a civilization with global reach. And if such a civilization existed, then its records may well have been carried forward through time, hidden in monastic libraries, passed between secret societies, and ultimately locked in the Vatican's subterranean vaults. Skeptics argue that the supposed outline of Antarctica could merely be South America drawn incorrectly, stretched by the mapmaker's limitations. Yet seismic studies from the 1950s onward showed that the subglacial terrain beneath East Antarctica matched the Piri Reis depiction with uncanny fidelity. To dismiss this as coincidence would be to ignore the convergence of multiple impossible details. Even the mountains shown on the Piri Reis chart align with the Queen Maud ranges discovered under the ice. If we accept that the map represents a genuine memory of pre-ice Antarctica, then history must be rewritten. The last time Antarctica was free of ice was at least 6,000 years ago, perhaps much longer. This pushes cartography back into a prehistoric world, into the realm of civilizations that official archaeology insists never existed. It forces us to confront the possibility of a forgotten chapter of humanity, a chapter that institutions like the Vatican may have worked diligently to obscure, not out of malice, but to preserve truths too destabilizing for their age. Why would the Vatican hide such knowledge? The answer lies in power. Geography is not just about land, it is about dominion. Knowing what lies across the seas determines trade, conquest, and influence. A map is a weapon as much as it is a tool. For a church that once mediated kings and claimed spiritual authority over empires, possessing maps of unknown lands meant holding secrets that could tip the balance of power. Revealing them might empower rivals, diminish divine authority, or raise uncomfortable questions about the origins of civilization itself. The Piri Reis map is therefore more than a historical curiosity. It is a crack in the wall of official history, a fleeting glimpse at a deeper tapestry. A tapestry of civilizations erased, of knowledge suppressed, of truths locked away. And it beckons us to imagine what other charts, maps, and manuscripts lie hidden beneath the Vatican, perhaps entire atlases of the world before the flood, before the ice, before the story of history was rewritten into the version we are taught today. The puzzle remains unsolved, but the existence of the Piri Reis map ensures that the questions cannot be ignored. Who first charted Antarctica? What civilization left behind records precise enough to guide an Ottoman admiral 1,000 years later? And above all, what does the Vatican know that we do not? The answer may never be given openly, but as long as one fragment of parchment can overturn centuries of accepted history, the possibility remains that the Vatican's vaults guard not just faith, but the forgotten maps of an ancient world. For centuries, maps have been our way of pinning the world into certainty. Ink on parchment, a way of saying, here's what exists, and beyond it, nothing. But the deeper we look into these ancient charts, the more we realize that certainty was always an illusion. Strange coastlines appear where no land should be. Entire continents drift in and out of recorded history, vanishing as though someone had erased them by hand. Were these simply mistakes, born of ignorance? Or were they traces of worlds that once were, worlds deliberately hidden from us? Take the case of High Brazil. Off the western coast of Ireland, mariners told of an island that rose from the mist once every 7 years. It was drawn on maps for centuries, a solid landmass, sometimes circular, sometimes ringed with rivers. To sailors, it was no phantom. It was as real as Spain or Greenland. Expeditions were launched in search of it. Captains swore they had seen its shores, its forests, even fires burning from settlements at night. Yet today, there is nothing there. The ocean is empty, the coordinates barren. And still, those maps remain, a reminder that for hundreds of years, cartographers believed in a land we are now told never existed. Then comes Lemuria, perhaps the most haunting of all the lost continents. In the 19th century, naturalists proposed it as an answer to a mystery: how identical species of lemurs and other creatures were found, both in India and Madagascar, separated by thousands of miles of ocean. The solution seemed obvious. There must once have been a vast continent bridging the two, now sunken beneath the sea. Scientists spoke of it openly. Atlases marked it confidently. But as tectonic theory rose, the idea was discarded, written off as pseudoscience. And yet, the legends across Asia and the Indian Ocean tell of a great drowned land. Tamil traditions speak of Kumari Kandam, a cradle of civilization swallowed by waves. The similarities are unsettling. Was Lemuria simply a scientific misstep, or was it an echo of a truth that institutions found inconvenient? Even Antarctica is not safe from this enigma. On the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, the southern landmass appears with shocking precision, and not as a frozen desert, but as a green, habitable land. This is more than a cartographic curiosity. Modern researchers using seismic scans of Antarctica's ice have discovered subglacial mountain ranges and coastlines, matching what is shown on that 16th century parchment. Whoever charted it had knowledge far beyond the accepted timeline of exploration. How? From where? We are left with the chilling possibility that ancient civilizations or guardians of forbidden archives knew of Antarctica long before it was discovered. These mysteries converge in the shadowed vaults of the Vatican, for within its secret archives lie maps that have never seen the light of day. Accounts from scholars allowed brief access speak of charts depicting lands that do not correspond to our modern globe. Fragments of continents, strange coastlines, erased islands. Why would the Church preserve these if they were simply errors? Why guard them under such secrecy if they meant nothing? Perhaps because they do not mean nothing at all. Consider the pattern. High Brazil, Lemuria, Antarctica, all stories of land that either disappeared or was hidden, all whispered through folklore, half remembered in myth, and then drawn with confidence by mapmakers. It is as though humanity once had knowledge of a larger world, one fractured, drowned, or deliberately erased from collective memory. The maps were not mistakes. They were evidence. Evidence that reality is not as stable as we are told. Some researchers suggest these vanished lands tie into the flood myths found across every culture, from Atlantis to Noah, from the Sumerian tablets to the Mayan codices. That great civilizations were wiped away, leaving behind fragments of knowledge, fragments of coastlines, scattered into the maps of later ages. What we dismiss as fantasy may simply be collective memory of cataclysm. And what the Vatican preserves may be the key, records of worlds that did not vanish by accident, but were buried in order to protect a narrative. A narrative where history begins only when authority allows it to. If this is true, then the oceans are not just emptiness. They are graves. Graves of entire civilizations. Graves of continents that were once vibrant and alive. Every blank space on the map becomes a tombstone, every erased island a warning. And yet, hidden in ink, the evidence refuses to stay silent. High Brazil, Lemuria, Antarctica. These names should not exist, and yet they persist. Like ghosts, they haunt the margins of our understanding, daring us to look deeper. Perhaps the cartographers were not liars. Perhaps they were witnesses. Witnesses to a truth we are not yet permitted to know. And the Vatican? Its silence speaks louder than any denial. For in its vaults, in its guarded halls, the maps remain, waiting. For centuries, the world believed the boundaries of Christendom ended where familiar maps faded into seas of uncertainty. Beyond the edges, the parchment dissolved into empty space, populated only by monsters, sea serpents, and divine warnings. Yet whispers persist that these uncharted waters were not entirely unknown. Hidden beneath the weight of sacred secrecy, the Church may have sponsored voyages, quiet expeditions, meant not for discovery, but for containment. The medieval world was not as ignorant as we are often told. The Islamic caliphates, the Chinese dynasties, and countless indigenous peoples all possessed maps of astonishing detail. But Europe, hemmed in by church authority, portrayed oceans as voids of terror. Still, there were those within the papal chambers who craved more than salvation. They craved knowledge. And so, clandestine missions are said to have begun, led not by kings or merchants, but by orders bound to the cross. The Knights Templar, often remembered as warrior monks, had amassed wealth, influence, and perhaps most importantly, networks that stretched from the ports of the Levant to the storm-battered coasts of Britain. Records suggest they were not merely soldiers, but custodians of information. Some historians argue that their ships, which outnumbered even those of the most powerful monarchs, may have carried more than gold. There are tales of voyages westward, across waters where no European nation dared to sail. If true, these journeys predated Columbus by centuries. But what they brought back, if anything, was not shared. Instead, whatever discoveries they made vanished with the suppression of their order, sealed beneath papal decrees and accusations of heresy. Yet the Templars were not alone. In later centuries, the Jesuits became the Church's intellectual vanguard. Their missions carried them into the deepest interiors of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. To the outside world, they came as missionaries, spreading the gospel and building schools. But beneath the surface, many believe they were cartographers of the forbiddens. Jesuit records, what survives of them, speak of meticulously charted rivers, mountain ranges, and celestial observations. Much of this information never entered public maps. Instead, the data was carried back to Rome, where select archives guarded it with an iron silence. Consider the papal envoys who traveled east along the Silk Road, long before Marco Polo became a household name. Papal letters from the 13th century describe exchanges with the Mongol court, notes about lands vast and unknown to most of Europe. But these writings, copied in secret, were never published in the form of maps for sailors or merchants. Why? Perhaps the Church feared that new lands implied new people's souls who had never known Christ. If entire civilizations existed beyond the accepted boundaries of the Christian world, what did that mean for doctrine? Would the Great Commission, Christ's command to spread the gospel to all nations, collapse under the revelation that Europe was not the center of creation? This, some scholars suggest, is why secret voyages remain secret. It was not greed, nor even political control, but the fear that geography itself might unravel theology. Imagine the shock of a medieval congregation told that great nations existed beyond their horizon, untouched by the Church's authority. Would not faith waver? Would not the Pope's dominion seem fragile, even provincial? Better, perhaps, to hide the evidence, to ensure that the world remained as it appeared in stained glass windows and illuminated manuscripts. Yet the evidence refuses to remain buried. There are curious anomalies maps that should not exist. The Piri-Reis map of 1513, drawn by an Ottoman admiral, famously depicts the coastlines of South America and even parts of Antarctica centuries before modern exploration. Scholars debate its origins, but one theory suggests that the map was based on far older charts, fragments copied from sources the Ottomans themselves acquired, possibly from crusaders or church archives. If so, then fragments of secret voyages may have survived in places the Vatican never intended. There is also the case of the Vinland map, a controversial artifact suggesting that Norse explorers reached the Americas long before Columbus. Though its authenticity remains debated, the idea that knowledge of these western lands existed in scattered whispers is difficult to dismiss. If Norsemen truly sailed there, could papal authorities have known? Could they have silenced reports, fearing that such revelations would challenge the divine narrative of discovery? And what of the maps reportedly locked within the Vatican itself? Rumors swirl of collections too fragile, too heretical, or too dangerous to be shown. Maps that might depict not only the Americas before Columbus, but coastlines, islands, and mountain ranges inconsistent with modern geography, suggesting either lost knowledge of ancient civilizations or records of lands since destroyed. If true, then the Vatican does not merely hold theology's secrets, but geographies as well. To some, this is nothing more than conspiracy, the product of imagination applied to gaps in the record. After all, archives burn, documents are lost, and cartographers embellish. But there is an undeniable pattern. Time and again, the Church possessed information earlier than the public, and time and again, that information was withheld until the appropriate narrative could be constructed. Whether through Jesuit missions reporting back on Chinese star charts, or Templar ships charting unknown coasts, the Church has long balanced on the knife's edge of revelation and suppression. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is not that the Church sought knowledge, but that it feared it. A map is not merely ink on parchment. It is a declaration of truth, a rewriting of man's place in the cosmos. To reveal new continents, new cultures, or new stars was to declare that humanity's story was larger, more complex, and less controlled than doctrine allowed. And so, the voyages remained shadows, their maps gathering dust behind locked doors, their discoveries absorbed into silence. But silence is rarely eternal. Whispers seep through cracks. A rediscovered chart here, a forbidden manuscript there. Like light through stained glass, fragments of truth refract into the world, each piece suggesting a greater whole. Perhaps one day those archives will open, and we will learn whether the Church indeed charted the edges of creation before the rest of the world dared to look. Until then, the question lingers like an unfinished map half drawn, half erased, waiting for the day it is finally complete. Deep within the Vatican's labyrinth of locked doors and guarded passages, whispers speak of a chamber that is neither chapel nor archive, but something far more unsettling, the map room. It is said to hold not only the geography of our world, but the ghostly outlines of lands that no longer exist, and others that, perhaps, should never have been recorded at all. Picture the atmosphere. A long hall lined with dark oak tables polished to a muted shine, their surfaces covered in parchment sheets, so ancient that even the air around them seems heavy with dust. At the center rests a golden globe, its continents strangely familiar, but subtly wrong, coastlines curving differently, islands drawn where today only waves stretch unbroken. The lamps above glow faintly yellow, casting a warmth that cannot disguise the chill one feels when staring too long at these relics. These are not just records of exploration. They are fragments of forbidden knowledge. For centuries, the Vatican collected maps from explorers, merchants, sailors, and spies. Some were gifts, others were seized, and still others perhaps stolen under cover of faith and diplomacy. These maps, though, are not the ordinary kind you find in textbooks or museums. They are annotated with cryptic Latin notes, sketches of strange beasts, and coastlines edged with red markings as though warning, this place should not be known. The margins whisper of dangers, both natural and supernatural, charting not just rivers and mountains, but portals, disasters, and disappearances. Take, for example, the persistent claims of maps showing a vast southern continent centuries before Antarctica was discovered. Early cartographers called it Terra Australis Incognita. the unknown southern land. But some of the maps preserved here, according to leaked accounts, depict its shores not as lifeless ice, but as fertile green coasts, dotted with settlements and trade routes. If true, this suggests someone, at some time long before official history, walked those lands and recorded what they saw. What civilization reached Antarctica before it was swallowed by ice? And why are such maps hidden rather than displayed? Other parchment sheets describe the coast of Africa with shocking accuracy centuries before Europeans sailed around it. Even more perplexing are the outlines of islands that no longer exist. One map bears the unmistakable shape of Atlantis, not as a mythical symbol, but as if charted by hand from a navigator's log. Around it, scribbled notes warn of its sudden vanishing, as if the cartographer himself had witnessed its destruction. Some claim that within these locked cabinets lies the Piri-Reis map, a document already famous outside the Vatican, but perhaps shown here in its complete form, unmarred by time. The portion we know stunned historians with its detail, showing the South American coast with uncanny precision at a time when most of Europe had no idea what lay beyond the Atlantic. But rumors say the Vatican copy extends further, revealing coastlines now lost and continents erased by catastrophe or secrecy. Why would the Church hoard such documents? Power. A map is more than a tool of navigation. It is a claim over knowledge, a claim over territory, and in this case, perhaps even a claim over time itself. To know the shape of lands that no longer exist is to hold evidence that history as we are taught is incomplete. And once you admit history is incomplete, authority begins to crumble. But there is something darker here as well. The annotations, written by countless hands across centuries, suggest the maps were not merely about geography. Some notes hint at gates, strange sites marked not by mountains or rivers, but by symbols of stars and circles, as though they corresponded with celestial alignments. In margins one might read, Hic transitum est, here is the passage. A chilling thought arises. Were these maps also guides to hidden doors in the world, places where the fabric of reality thins? Scholars who claim to have glimpsed fragments describe references to vanished islands like High Brazil, believed in Irish legend to appear once every 7 years before sinking again into the sea. One parchment even traces a route across the Atlantic, leading to this mysterious isle, its coordinates carefully drawn. Did sailors truly reach it? If they did, what did they see? Why would such accounts be preserved in the Vatican unless there was truth the Church found dangerous to admit? And then there are the maps of the heavens. Not just constellations as we know them, but charts of star systems aligned with earthly sites. Temples, pyramids, and megalithic structures are plotted with uncanny precision against the stars. It suggests that whoever compiled these documents believed the earth itself was part of a grander celestial map, that our monuments were markers in a design spanning both heaven and earth. If this is true, then the Vatican's map room is not merely a record of where humanity has traveled, but a guide to where we are meant to go. The weight of secrecy is heavy here. Every locked drawer, every sealed cabinet seems to whisper that the past is not what we think it is. To imagine standing in that chamber is to feel the pull of countless lost worlds tugging at your mind, daring you to question. These are not just forgotten coastlines, not just drowned islands. They are reminders that reality is fragile, and that whole chapters of human existence can vanish, erased not only by water and fire, but by deliberate silence. And so the map room remains sealed, a vault of forbidden geography. Whether it holds evidence of ancient explorers who crossed the globe before Columbus, or of civilizations now buried under ice and ocean, or of portals and paths best left undiscovered, one truth seems certain. Its parchments contain knowledge that could redraw the story of humanity itself. And that, perhaps, is why it must remain hidden, buried under layers of secrecy and guarded by those who fear what it might reveal. Knowledge has always been the sharpest weapon. Armies may conquer cities, kings may command vast empires, but it is the control of knowledge that decides who writes history, who shapes faith, and who defines reality itself. The mysterious maps locked away in Vatican vaults were more than just parchment and ink. They hinted at worlds long forgotten, civilizations erased from memory, and truths that could shatter the foundations upon which entire nations were built. Why hide them? Because maps are not passive records of geography. They are instruments of power. They chart not only land and sea, but also trade, dominion, and belief. A map that showed continents long before their discovery by Europe would undermine centuries of biblical chronology and imperial pride. It would suggest that humanity's story was older, richer, and perhaps guided by civilizations lost to time. To the medieval church, such implications were dangerous enough to be sealed away in darkness. Imagine the upheaval if the faithful learned that the earth had been fully mapped long before Columbus unfurled his sails. If the coastlines of Antarctica were drawn centuries before satellites confirmed their shape. Such revelations would erode the church's authority, for it had claimed to be the steward of divine truth, the guardian of sacred history. To admit otherwise, that there were forces older, wiser, and more advanced than what Scripture allowed, would fracture the fragile order of faith and obedience. But there was another dimension, more earthly and pragmatic. Maps were keys to wealth. Whoever held them held routes to spices, gold, and uncharted lands. In an age when oceans were barriers, and the horizon was still a place of myth, possessing a secret map was like holding the future itself. Empires rose and fell on trade routes. Armadas sailed not just on waves, but on lines drawn in ink. If the Vatican possessed maps of lost continents, it meant it held a silent power over kings and explorers alike. Consider the age of discovery. Columbus, Magellan, Vespucci all heralded as brave pioneers, venturing into the unknown. Yet whispers persist that some of them carried fragments of maps far older than their lifetimes, guiding their paths across the seas. What if their voyages were not acts of discovery at all, but rediscovery following trails, carefully hidden, yet secretly preserved in the church's vaults? If so, then history itself has been rewritten, dressing up old knowledge as new triumphs. Control of these maps meant control of history's narrative, and the church understood that. Knowledge could not simply be shared. It had to be managed, shaped, wielded like a blade. The average villager could not be told of lands beyond the horizon. It would raise questions about man's place in creation, about God's chosen order, about why certain truths had been denied. The church had built centuries of authority on answers it alone could provide. Too much knowledge in the wrong hands was not liberation. It was chaos. And yet, power always tempts its holders. If the Vatican did safeguard these maps, were they ever used for gain? Did popes and cardinals direct kings in subtle ways, pushing them toward conquest and away from rival shores? Did explorers ever find themselves guided by divine counsel that was, in truth, little more than geography locked away from others? The answers may be buried beneath centuries of silence, but the logic is clear. Whoever controlled the maps controlled the world. Even the biblical narrative was at stake. The church had tied its authority to the Genesis timeline, insisting humanity was only a few thousand years old, created in divine image upon a young earth. Yet if these maps proved the existence of advanced civilizations tens of thousands of years earlier, the illusion would crack. Scripture would bend under the weight of evidence. The faithful would ask, if the church was wrong about the age of the world, what else might it have hidden? It was not only faith at risk, it was empire. The Portuguese crown, the Spanish monarchy, the great powers of Europe each leaned heavily on the church's blessing. Papal decrees carved the new world into halves, assigning continents like prizes in a game of divine monopoly. But beneath those holy proclamations may have lurked another truth, that the church already knew the shape of the world and parceled it out with cold precision. To hoard knowledge is to play God, to decide what humanity may and may not know. The maps, if real, were more than secrets. They were instruments of dominion, a reminder that truth is not always suppressed because it is false, but because it is too dangerous to reveal. And this is the heart of forbidden knowledge. Once released, it cannot be contained again. If a farmer in the 14th century saw a map of continents across the sea, he would question why his priest told him that Eden was the beginning of all things. If a sailor glimpsed coastlines drawn centuries before his voyage, he would wonder whether his courage was his own or scripted by a hand unseen. The Church understood that once these questions spread, they would ignite a fire it could not put out. Knowledge is power, but power, when threatened, becomes tyranny. The maps locked away beneath the Vatican are more than ancient curiosities. They represent the eternal struggle between truth and control, between those who seek to illuminate and those who profit from darkness. Perhaps that is why they remain hidden still. For to see them would not only redraw the borders of the world, it would redraw the borders of history, faith, and human identity itself. For centuries, whispers have circled among scholars, researchers, and even Vatican insiders who dared to claim they had caught fleeting glimpses of something extraordinary. Not relics of saints or secret treaties between kings, but maps that did not belong to the world we thought we knew. These were not the neat charts of European exploration, nor the decorative illustrations found in medieval libraries. They were strange, aged manuscripts that seemed to trace coastlines centuries before they were discovered, routes across oceans that had not yet been sailed, and lands drawn in cryptic detail that official history insists were impossible to know. It often begins in the margins of memoirs, in a line or two that scholars overlook. A Jesuit in the 17th century writing vaguely of geographies too delicate for the faithful to see. A Renaissance cartographer hinting at sources that would endanger one's soul if revealed. Such fragments alone might be dismissed as metaphors, yet the pattern repeats across languages, continents, and decades. The idea lingers that locked away in Vatican vaults lies a set of manuscripts that map not only the known world, but the forbidden one. In 1907, an Italian historian named Cesare Lucchesi wrote privately to a colleague in Florence. His letter, preserved in part by his family, describes being granted rare access to a restricted collection of papal archives. Within a folder of nautical records, he claimed to find a map of the American continent, dated nearly a century before Columbus ever set sail. The handwriting was clear, the coastlines shockingly accurate. But when he requested permission to study the map further, the folder was withdrawn, and he was politely told that he had seen enough. Lucchesi never published his discovery, but the letter survives, tucked away in his personal papers. The skeptics argue this is nothing more than invention, a scholar embellishing his career through dramatic storytelling. Yet why would he risk ridicule in private correspondence? Why mention a document that, if fabricated, could never be verified? What purpose does it serve to plant a rumor that undermines his own credibility? These inconsistencies gnaw at the edges of reason. Even more troubling are the memoirs of Father Matthias Greenwald, a German priest stationed in Rome during the late 1800s. In his diaries, he refers to the Atlanti Proibito, the Forbidden Atlas. He does not describe it directly, only noting how a single glimpse would alter a man's understanding of creation itself. Some scholars dismiss this as allegorical, but Greenwald's other entries are meticulous. Records of daily masses, names of bishops he dined with, inventories of gifts from patrons. Why, then, would he suddenly indulge in cryptic metaphor only when speaking of hidden maps? Rumors hardened into something closer to testimony in the mid-20th century. A former Vatican employee, who later defected and spoke to Italian journalists under anonymity, claimed that a cartographic chamber existed deep within the archives. He described cabinets filled not with scrolls of theology, but with bound collections of maps tracing lands both ancient and strangely modern. He mentioned Antarctica, not as an ice-locked desert, but as a habitable landscape. He mentioned coastlines of South America, drawn with such precision they rivaled modern satellite imagery. His words were ridiculed, brushed aside as the ramblings of a disgruntled worker. Yet the detail with which he described the archive rooms aligned with known layouts of the restricted sections, details that would be difficult for an outsider to fabricate. The leaks did not stop there. Letters from early 20th century archaeologists occasionally hinted at frustration when Vatican curators declined to share certain manuscripts. In 1923, a Spanish researcher named Ortega wrote, "The document I sought exists. I was told it could not be lent nor copied. They would neither deny its presence nor allow me to confirm it. Such silence is more damning than any refusal." His words echo the experiences of many others who petitioned for access, granted permission, only to be guided down carefully curated paths, never allowed near the shadows where the most tantalizing secrets supposedly lay. What emerges from these whispers is a mosaic of partial truths, unverified claims, and tantalizing absences. The scholars themselves seem conflicted. Some retreat into silence, fearful of reputational ruin. Others speak boldly, only to be discredited and forgotten. Yet the repetition across centuries, the consistency of certain themes, maps of lands too early, atlases too precise, plants a seed of unease. Even when the stories contradict, they orbit the same core. The Vatican may be guarding not just relics of the past, but knowledge of worlds unacknowledged. And herein lies the fuel for the mythos. The absence of proof does not extinguish the whispers. It magnifies them. Silence becomes its own kind of evidence, a vacuum that people fill with imagination, suspicion, and dread. If nothing exists, why keep the doors locked? If there is no atlas, why so carefully curate what researchers may or may not see? The scholars who dared to speak of what they glimpsed are long gone, their letters scattered, their reputations buried. Yet the fragments remain, like sparks caught in dry straw, waiting for belief to ignite them into flame. What we are left with is not confirmation, but tension. Hints that suggest, testimonies that tempt, and leaks that dissolve into ambiguity. In this way, the whispers themselves become more powerful than any map could ever be. They feed a legend that refuses to die, a story that continues to slip between the lines of history, lingering like a shadow across the face of the Vatican vault. For as long as we have traced lines across parchment and vellum, the edges of maps have carried a certain weight. They were not merely geographic boundaries. They were borders of the known, the seen, the permissible. Yet scattered across archives, locked away in vaults, or dismissed as curiosities, there exist maps that whisper of lands that should not exist. Continents drawn where oceans are meant to stretch unbroken. Coastlines etched centuries before explorers claimed to have found them. Cities marked in places where no settlement should have stood. The most famous of these is the Piri-Reis map, compiled in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral who claimed his sources stretched back to antiquity. On it, unmistakably, lies the jagged outline of South America. But stranger still is the landmass depicted at the southern edge, an Antarctic coast, not buried beneath ice, but drawn as if surveyed in warmer times. How could such detail exist centuries before Antarctica's discovery, and long before the means to map it were available? Some historians insist it is coincidence, or a misinterpretation. Others quietly acknowledge what the map suggests, that fragments of knowledge survived from a time when forgotten eyes had already seen these lands. The Vinland map tells another story. Supposedly from the 15th century, it shows the coast of North America well before Columbus ever set sail. To some, it is a forgery crafted to rewrite history for political or religious ends. But if it is authentic, then it points to journeys across the Atlantic that were deliberately obscured. overwritten by the narrative of first discovery. History, after all, is not only written by victors, it is redrawn by them. Even older are whispers of maps lost to time, charts from the Library of Alexandria, codices from forgotten empires, seafaring records of cultures we do not name. Legends speak of civilizations who understood the stars and seas with such precision that they mapped the Earth in ways we are only beginning to replicate. Could they have charted territories erased by catastrophe? Islands swallowed by the sea, continents shifted by tectonic convulsions, or realms we dismiss as myth, Atlantis, Mu, Lemuria names, spoken with disdain by academics, yet hauntingly persistent across cultures. But the danger of these maps is not merely what they depict, it is what they imply. If knowledge existed before the ages we mark as the dawn of civilization, then our timeline is fractured. If great cultures thrived before history admits they could, then we are not the pinnacle, but merely the survivors. And if coastlines now buried beneath miles of ice were once known and walked upon, then our understanding of the Earth's past climate, and perhaps its cycles, is incomplete. This is why these documents are often hidden, debated into silence, or explained away as errors. To acknowledge them openly would be to unravel the scaffolding of history itself. It would mean that the story we teach, the neat progression from primitive tribes to modern states, has missing chapters deliberately torn out. And that knowledge, once revealed, cannot be contained. Consider what it means for the present. If ancient hands mapped the Antarctic coast, then those same hands knew of climates shifting in cycles we have only just begun to fear. If lost maps of submerged lands are true, then entire civilizations have risen and vanished before, erased not by myth but by water. And if other continents or islands once stood where now the ocean rules, then our own future is written in their fate. Perhaps this is why such maps remain suppressed. They are not simply curiosities for historians, they are warnings. To admit their truth would be to confront our fragility and the arrogance of believing our world to be permanent. It would challenge the foundations of empires, religions, and nations built upon the idea of being first, chosen, or exceptional. For if others came before us, greater perhaps than we dare admit, then what does that make us? The lands beyond the map are more than places, they are possibilities. They suggest civilizations who read the stars as easily as we read screens, who crossed oceans long before compasses, who endured long enough to leave fragments of their vision carved into parchment and stone. And they force us to ask, why were they forgotten? Was it mere accident, or was it deliberate? Did the tides of nature erase them, or did someone decide their memory was too dangerous to survive? Standing here, centuries later, we hold the fragments. A line of coast here, a mountain there, a suggestion of something vast and unacknowledged. Together, they form a shadow history, one that challenges the version of the world we have been taught. It is tempting to dismiss it, to return to the safety of known timelines, but the maps will not vanish. They endure as stubbornly as the lands they depict, and so we are left with a choice. Do we accept the neatness of official history, or do we peer beyond the edges of the chart into the territories marked unknown, because it is there, in those blank spaces, that the truth might wait? If these forbidden maps were unveiled tomorrow, not as curiosities, but as undeniable proof of civilizations predating our memory, would we be ready? Would we see them as revelations or as threats? Perhaps the real question is simpler still. If the lands beyond the map were revealed, would humanity have the courage to admit it was never truly first?